All right, gurus, welcome back to part 2 of this demo lesson, Implement an Azure Application Gateway. Last, when we left off in part 1, we had successfully deployed our Azure Application Gateway. And now at this point that the resource exists, we're going to validate that it is appropriately balancing our traffic to our app service. And then we're going to take a look at some additional features like rewrite rules and the web application firewall. So we'll click go to the resource group here. We'll see we have our application gateway. We'll click on it here. And the first thing that we notice is we have that front-end private IP that we set. We have our tier here. We have our virtual network and subnet configuration, the location, and we have that front-end public IP address, which if we copy here, and then we bring into a new tab, and then paste it in and hit enter, will be balanced to our app service. Now, we notice here it's not secure, and if you remember, it was an HTTPS URL. That's because that listener that we configured is using port 80 in the front end. The reason we configured HTTPS in the back end using a well-known CA cert is because we had to, so that it would balance traffic to this web application. So we'll go back to our application gateway here. We'll go down to our web application firewall. And here we can choose to enable and disable that firewall. We can choose our firewall mode of detection or prevention. We can specify exclusions when evaluating those requests that are coming through our web application firewall here. And additionally, we can take a look at the rules here. We have rule sets, and we can choose from these manage rule sets from OWASP, Top 10s, and Microsoft manage rule sets. And then if we choose to enable advanced rule configuration here, we can also take a look at the rules that exist, and we can enable or disable those rules from those various rule sets. Now also, if we come over here under settings and we go to our rewrites, we'll see that we can actually create a rewrite set. And this will provide us another set of rules that we'll be able to evaluate when we're sending traffic through our application gateway. We'll call this our rewrite set, and then we're going to associate it to our default routing rule. We'll click next here, and then we're going to click add a rewrite rule. Here we can configure what we want to name this rewrite rule. We're going to leave the default naming here, and we can choose to add conditions and actions. We'll add a condition here, and we see it's got this if-then logic that it follows for this rewrite rule. We can choose to configure this by clicking on it here, and we can see what type of variable we want to check here. For example, HTTP header or a server variable. Let's say we want to check a server variable here. We select what server variable we want to use, and in this case, let's say we want to use a query string. So we'll find query string here, select it, and we can choose whether or not we want it to be case sensitive. In this case, we'll say no, and we'll choose our operator here of equal or not equal. We'll choose equal. We'll say if the query string matches the pattern of foo, and we'll click OK to configure that. Then we're going to take an action, which is our then action here. We'll click to configure this action, and we'll say what we're going to do here is we're going to rewrite the URL here. And as we notice here, it says that when URL rewrite is configured on a WAF-enabled application gateway, WAF evaluation will take place on the rewritten request headers and URL. So what we're going to do here is we're going to set the URL, and we're going to make sure that we set the query string to bar. And so we'll click OK and configure that. So it reads if server variable query string equals foo, then we're going to set the URL query string to bar. And we could choose to create this here, but we're not going to create it. We're not going to mess with the rewrite rule any further. Knowing that it's here and understanding how to set it up is more than enough to prepare us for the exam. So at this point, we're going to click back into our application gateway here. And that pretty much sums up the demo of creating our application gateway. Now let's make our way back to the slides for a quick review. All right, gurus, congratulations on following along in the demonstration and getting some experience in implementing Application Gateway. The key takeaways from this demo lesson here are that the purpose of our Application Gateway is to provide that regional Layer 7 load balancing to compute resources like virtual machine scale sets, virtual machines, app services, IP addresses, and fully qualified domain names. Again, as we saw, we can have a combination backend pool. Now, whenever we're using a combination of, say, for example, a VM and an app service, we have to do this through the PowerShell. It's not supported through the portal, as we saw in our demo. Now, also, with our application gateway, we have the difference between V1 and V2 SKUs, and optionally, between V1 and V2 whether or not we want to have a web application firewall that has those managed rule sets for us using OWASP or the Microsoft managed rules. We'll get more into web application firewall in a later section, but it's important to understand that it exists, and that we can use it to protect our web applications. Now, as we saw in our demonstration, it all starts off with balancing traffic from our client to our Azure Application Gateway and the resources that exist behind it. And we have listeners on our Azure Application Gateway that are listening for one or more sites, and then it has an associated routing rule that has other things like an HTTP setting associated with it and a backend target, so we can route our traffic to the correct backend targets in our Application Gateway solution. Thanks so much for joining me, Gurus. That's all for now on Azure Application Gateways. I look forward to seeing you in the rest of this course. For now, keep being awesome, Gurus.